Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. I want you to imagine you're driving like 80 miles an hour down the highway.
Okay, yeah, I'm picturing it.
The weather is perfectly clear, you've got your favorite music playing, and you are just absolutely cruising.
Right, you're totally in the zone.
Exactly. You feel completely, unquestionably confident that you know exactly where you're going.
Yeah, that bulletproof kind of confidence.
But then you glance up and notice that the road signs are facing the wrong way.
Oh man, that terrifying realization.
Right. It hits you that you are speeding down the wrong side of the highway. Everyone around you is swerving.
Which is just a chilling image.
It is, because you realize that the absolute bulletproof confidence you had just a second ago wasn't just wrong. It was the exact thing making you so incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, because certainty blinds us.
Yeah.
Like if you were unsure of the road, you would be driving 15 miles an hour.
Right. Checking your mirrors, looking for landmarks.
Exactly. Hyper aware of your surroundings. But confidence just completely removes that hesitation.
And when you remove hesitation while heading in the wrong direction,
The collateral damage is immense.
yeah, and that terrifying realization that bulletproof confidence driving massive collateral damage is what we're unpacking today.
It really is.
We are taking a deep dive into the history of mental illness. And when you look at the historical and medical sources, you see a medical establishment that was, generation after generation, confidently speeding down the wrong side of the highway.
I mean, it is arguably one of the most deeply unsettling paradoxes in the history of science and medicine.
And unsettling is definitely the word for it.
Because for the vast majority of documented human history, individuals experiencing severe mental illness weren't merely neglected, or just left to their own devices.
Right. They were actively harmed.
Actively, methodically harmed by the very institutions and practices that explicitly claim to be treating them.
We are talking about decades spent in, solitary squalor, heavy iron restraints.
Relentless bloodletting.
Yeah, the surgical severing of the brain's frontal lobes. And physicians intentionally injecting massive doses of insulin just to force patients into comas.
But the part that is so crucial to understand, the part that makes this a real exercise in epistemic humility, is that these weren't the actions of sadists.
Right. These weren't fringe quacks operating in a basement somewhere.
That is the core of the paradox right there. These interventions represented the absolute, unquestioned scientific consensus of their time.
Wow. So they thought they were doing the right thing.
The physicians performing lobotomies or, chaining patients to walls genuinely believed they were delivering cutting-edge, compassionate care.
That's just wild.
They were applying theories that commanded widespread professional agreement. They even presented papers at prestigious medical conferences defending these exact practices.
Which means our mission for this deep dive isn't to sit here in the 21st century and just wag our fingers at the doctors of the 18th century, congratulating ourselves on how enlightened we are.
Exactly. That misses the point entirely.
This deep dive is really about recognizing that our current knowledge is always fundamentally limited.
The history of mental health is basically a centuries-long demonstration of what happens when profound, terrifying human suffering collides with institutional power.
And the desperate need for a solution.
Right. It forces us to ask how society defines what is normal and what it does to those who cannot comply with that definition.
And if you're listening right now thinking this is just a dry history lesson about medieval asylums, think again.
Yeah, this is incredibly relevant today.
Because we are currently living through a documented, undeniable rise in anxiety, depression, and profound loneliness, especially among young people.
Every single longitudinal public health survey we looked at points to a massive, accelerating contemporary crisis.
We cannot possibly understand our current crisis without understanding the frameworks that birthed our modern system.
Why our diagnostic manuals look the way they do, why our pharmaceutical interventions have the limitations they do.
Or why our city streets look the way they do. Every single era believes it finally has the objective truth, only for the next era to look back in absolute horror.
So true.
So let's trace the route. Let's figure out how we got here. To do that, we have to rewind to the very first attempts human beings made to conceptualize mental suffering.
Way before therapy, before pills, before asylums.
Right, we have to look at the supernatural frameworks.
Yes, the oldest documented medical texts we possess approach what we would now call psychiatric illness, completely through the lens of the divine and the demonic.
Like the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus, which was written around 1550 BCE.
Right.
Psychological disturbances in that text are explicitly described as the work of evil spirits, or the direct result of provoking the wrath of the gods.
And then a few centuries later, you have the Mesopotamian Diagnostic Handbook from the 11th century BCE.
Yeah, and that one attributes abnormal mental states, like severe paranoia or hallucinations, directly to demonic possession.
Which meant the treatments prescribed were exorcisms, incantations, and complex religious rituals.
From our vantage point today, sitting here with our knowledge of neurochemistry and genetics, the immediate temptation is to just dismiss this entire era as hopelessly primitive.
Oh, absolutely. We hear exorcism and we instantly think of irrational superstition.
Right.
But if we want to truly understand the history of medicine, we really have to look past the supernatural veneer and analyze the vital social and psychological function these frameworks served.
How do you mean? Because, it's very hard for a modern listener to hear demonic possession and see any kind of functional utility in it.
Well, think about the lived reality of a family in ancient Mesopotamia.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine someone you love deeply, like your sibling or your child, suddenly undergoes a radical behavioral shift.
Okay.
They stop sleeping. They begin speaking in a disorganized, terrifying manner, responding to voices that aren't there.
That would be incredibly scary.
They become aggressive, or perhaps they just fall into a profound catatonic stupor.
And the terror would be unimaginable because you have absolutely no concept of a brain disease, right? No idea what a neurotransmitter even is.
Complete, overwhelming helplessness. You are literally watching a person vanish before your eyes.
Yeah.
So in that state of acute crisis, a supernatural framework actually does three incredibly important things. First, it provides an explanation.
Okay.
It takes the terrifying unknown and gives it a name, a specific demon or a specific angry deity.
That makes sense.
Second, it assigns agency, removing the blame from the sufferer. It's not that your brother is evil, it's that an external force has taken hold of him.
And third, it gives the family a checklist. It tells them what to do next.
Exactly the point. It offers a concrete pathway for action. When the priest prescribes a specific ritual or a sacrifice or a lengthy exorcism, the family regains a sense of agency.
They aren't just sitting in the dark, paralyzed by fear.
Right. They are actively working to save their loved one.
Yeah.
So the explanatory framework might be biologically inaccurate, but as a psychological coping mechanism for the community, it is incredibly sophisticated.
It contained the panic. But obviously, a framework based on angry gods doesn't give you much room to actually study the physical body.
No, it really doesn't.
For that, the historical sources show we had to wait for the ancient Greeks. This is where the pivot happens.
Yes, the transition from the supernatural to the naturalistic. The emergence of Hippocratic medicine represents one of the most profound conceptual leaps in human history.
We're talking about the four humors, right? The idea that the human body is filled with black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood.
That's the one. Hippocratic physicians believed that madness wasn't a curse from the gods, but a physical imbalance of these fluids.
So too much black bile meant you were melancholic, which is what we would call depressed.
Right, and an excess of blood caused mania. Hippocrates famously wrote about epilepsy, describing it not as a sacred disease touched by the divine, but as a physical disease of the brain.
Now, we need to be very clear about the mechanics here because it's pretty out there.
It is. The humoral theory was based on this philosophical mapping of the macrocosm to the microcosm.
Like earth, wind, and fire.
Exactly. The Greeks observed the natural world, earth, air, fire, and water, and deduced that the human body must contain corresponding elements. So black bile corresponded to the cold, dry nature of earth.
Okay.
Yellow bile was the hot, dry nature of fire.
So it was essentially an elaborate philosophical guessing game. I mean, the underlying biology was completely, demonstrably false.
Entirely false. But the biological inaccuracy is actually less important than the philosophical revolution it represents.
How so?
By insisting that mental illness is an earthly physical problem, a disease of the body rather than a divine punishment, the Greeks completely altered the trajectory of human response.
Because if it's a physical disease, you can theoretically fix it with physical interventions. You don't need a priest anymore, you need a physician.
Precisely. It brings the problem out of the heavens and down to the laboratory, so to speak. But as you noted with our highway analogy earlier, a wrong map can be incredibly dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. Because centuries later, Galen took this humoral theory and built it into an unshakable, comprehensive medical system that dominated Europe for over a millennium. Yes, he did. And if you truly believe that mania is caused by an excess of blood boiling in the brain, well, what's a logical scientific treatment?
Bloodletting.
Right. And not just the little prick of the finger either. We are talking about physicians aggressively draining massive amounts of blood from frantic, terrified patients.
Until they physically passed out from hypovolemic shock.
It's horrifying. They would also induce violent vomiting and diarrhea with toxic purgatives to clear out excess bile.
Or plunge manic patients into freezing water to shock their humors back into balance.
The logic was perfectly internally consistent, but the application was horrific.
The physical interventions were consistently traumatic and frequently fatal. Yet that intellectual thread survived. The foundational premise that psychiatric symptoms have physiological causes was a pilot light that stayed lit.
However faintly, through the centuries. But that pilot light flickered severely as we moved into the medieval and early modern periods.
It really did.
The naturalistic progress of the Greeks got deeply entangled with a fierce resurgence of the supernatural.
It's a highly complex era. The medieval period is often caricatured as the Dark Ages, a time of pure superstition. But the reality in the sources shows it was a messy, uneasy coexistence.
Right. On one hand, you had monastic institutions providing actual care. The church felt a profound obligation to the sick and marginalized.
Exactly. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, which later became infamous as Bedlam, was actually founded in 1247.
Which makes it one of the oldest institutions in the world dedicated to housing the mentally ill. So there was an institutional, somewhat medicalized response happening.
And there was. But this institutional care coexisted alongside an increasingly rigid, systematized demonology.
Right.
The idea that spiritual corruption or a literal pact with the devil could manifest as madness began to dominate the theological and legal landscape.
And this ideological shift culminated in the absolute horrors of the witch trials between the 15th and 17th centuries.
Yes.
This is where the history becomes incredibly dark. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 seems to be the critical catalyst here. It was basically a manual for identifying and prosecuting witches.
It was a highly detailed, authoritative text used by inquisitors and secular courts across Europe. And what makes it so relevant to the history of mental illness is how it weaponized human distress.
How did it do that?
The Malleus Maleficarum provided a rigid framework that took behaviors we easily recognize today as psychiatric symptoms and redefined them as empirical proof of a demonic pact.
Behaviors like hallucinations or severe postpartum psychosis.
Profound dissociation or even the motor convulsions of epilepsy.
And once a physician or an inquisitor decides your psychosis isn't an imbalance of humors, but a conscious, heretical deal made with Satan, you aren't a patient anymore.
No, not at all. You're a profound threat to the spiritual safety of the entire community.
You become a criminal of the highest order. While the sources note that historians caution against retrospectively diagnosing people from hundreds of years ago with modern DSM categories, the behavioral descriptions in the trial records are pretty unmistakable.
They really are.
Many of the women tortured and executed as witches were individuals suffering from severe, untreated neurological and psychiatric conditions.
The explanatory framework shifted back to the supernatural, and the treatment became state-sanctioned execution.
It's a devastating regression. And as we move out of the witch trial era and into the 17th and 18th centuries, society shifts its approach again. We stop executing people en masse, but we start locking them away on an industrial scale.
Yes, this is the era of the Great Confinement.
The birth of the institutional asylum system. But we have to be very careful with the word hospital here.
Because places like the Hôpital Général in Paris, which opened in 1657, were not hospitals in any modern sense of the word.
Right, they weren't places of healing.
Not at all. To understand the Great Confinement, we have to look at the work of philosophers like Michel Foucault, which is highlighted in our sources. He argued that the sudden, massive push to build these fortresses wasn't driven by medical breakthroughs.
It was driven by economics, or
Yes,
CF.
it was driven by the changing economic and social order of early modern Europe. Society was reorganizing around early capitalism, urbanization, and very strict social norms.
So anyone who didn't fit into that neat, productive new order became a problem to be solved. I think of it like a societal junk drawer.
The junk drawer.
Yeah, you know when you have a drawer in your kitchen, and instead of organizing the rubber bands, the dead batteries, the spare keys, and the unpaid bills, you just shove them all in there and slam it shut so the counter looks clean.
That analogy captures the institutional dynamic perfectly. These early institutions were catch-alls for the socially inconvenient. If you walk the halls of an 18th century asylum, you wouldn't just find people suffering from schizophrenia or profound mania.
Yeah.
You would find the desperately poor, vagrants, petty criminals, the physically disabled,
Unmarried mothers, political dissidents.
all housed alongside the severely mentally ill.
Madness became a weaponized category. It was a fluid label used by the state to legally contain anyone who threatened the social order or just couldn't participate in the emerging economy.
They were warehoused. Physical confinement was the primary objective. Medical treatment was an afterthought, if it existed at all.
The conditions described in the sources were genuinely appalling. Overcrowding, filth, people chained to stone walls for years.
Treated more like dangerous animals in a menagerie than citizens.
Yeah.
In fact, in places like Bedlam, the public could literally pay a penny to walk through the galleries and mock the inmates for entertainment.
Again, speeding down the wrong side of the highway. We went from ancient naturalism to medieval executions to early modern dungeons.
It's grim.
But right at the end of the 18th century, the pendulum swings with incredible violence in the opposite direction. We get the moral treatment revolution.
And it truly was a revolution, both conceptually and practically.
The story always centers around Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England. There's this legendary story in the texts of Pinel taking charge of the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris in 1793, right in the middle of the French Revolution.
It's a very dramatic moment in history.
The story goes that he walked into this dungeon, demanded the iron chains be struck from the inmates, and declared them patients. Now, historians debate if he literally took a hammer to the chains himself, but the symbolic shift is undeniable.
The exact mechanics of the unchaining matter less than the philosophical earthquake it caused. Pinel and Tuke were asserting a radical new premise.
Which was?
That mental illness does not strip a person of their humanity. If they are suffering from an illness, rather than a moral failing or demonic influence, then they are patients.
And patients require compassion, dignity, and a therapeutic environment.
Exactly. Which brings us to William Tuke and the York Retreat, founded in 1796.
Right. If the Hospital General was a junk drawer, the York Retreat was like a radical experiment in environmental psychology. How did Tuke's model actually work?
Well, Tuke was a Quaker, and his approach was deeply rooted in humanistic principles. He fundamentally rejected the medical consensus of bloodletting and purgatives.
So no more draining blood.
Right. Instead, he built a therapeutic community. The architecture of the York Retreat looked like a large, comfortable country farmhouse, not a prison. There were no bars on the windows.
I just can't imagine how shocking that must have been to the medical establishment at the time. Taking people who were considered wild beasts and putting them in a nice farmhouse?
It was viewed with extreme skepticism, but the underlying mechanism of Tuke's moral treatment was highly structured.
Okay.
The patients were treated with unfailing kindness and respect, which naturally lowered their baseline agitation. They were given meaningful occupation, too. They farmed the land, sowed, baked, and cared for animals.
That provided structure, routine, and a sense of purpose. Crucially, they were treated as moral agents capable of self-control, which fostered a profound psychological shift in how they viewed themselves.
And the most incredible part of this entire era is that the outcomes documented at the York Retreat were astonishingly good.
Really?
Yes. People who had been chained in basements for a decade, covered in their own filth, were suddenly walking the gardens, engaging in conversation, and in many cases returning to their families.
Wow. Which proved a monumental point then. The relational and environmental conditions of psychiatric care can profoundly alter the trajectory of the illness, completely independent of biological interventions.
Exactly. They didn't have antipsychotic medication in 1796. They changed the social environment, lowered the stress response, provided dignity, and the patient's psychiatric symptoms markedly improved.
But wait, if the York Retreat was so successful, why aren't all psychiatric facilities built like that today? What went wrong?
What went wrong was a tragic collision between idealistic reform and brutal logistical reality. The problem ultimately was scale.
Scale. Because the success of these small, intimate retreats generated massive demand.
Yes, throughout the 19th century, governments across Europe and the United States passed laws mandating the construction of public asylums to provide this moral treatment to everyone.
But you cannot mass-produce intimacy.
You really can't. The moral treatment model relied entirely on a high ratio of dedicated staff who knew every patient's idiosyncrasies, their triggers, and their history.
And as the 19th century progressed, these new state asylums quickly filled up. A building designed for 200 patients soon held 500.
Then 1,000. Then 3,000.
And when you have 3,000 profoundly distressed people in one building, the therapeutic community just collapses. You aren't doing environmental psychology anymore. You're just doing crowd control.
Exactly. The administrative burden of simply feeding, clothing, and preventing violence among thousands of inmates overrode any attempt at individualized care.
So the asylums devolved back into custodial warehouses?
The chains might have been gone, replaced by straitjackets and padded rooms, but the therapeutic optimism of Pinel and Tuke was dead.
And the death of that optimism leads to one of the most chilling psychological shifts in the medical profession. Because if you are an asylum superintendent in 1890, walking the wards among thousands of chronically ill people who never seem to get better, you have to rationalize your failure.
Right. And that rationalization was called therapeutic nihilism.
Therapeutic nihilism.
It's the belief that a condition is fundamentally untreatable. The medical consensus shifted away from environmental factors and latched onto the idea that mental illness was a rigid, hereditary degeneration of the brain.
So if a patient didn't improve, it wasn't because the overcrowded asylum was failing them.
No, it was because they were genetically destined to be mad. The illness was baked into their constitutional makeup.
And when the medical establishment decides an illness is entirely genetic and entirely incurable, the focus shifts from treating the patient to protecting the society.
Which brings us to the darkest logical endpoint of therapeutic nihilism, the eugenics movement of the early 20th century.
We have to talk about this impartially, looking strictly at how the medical and legal frameworks evolved according to the texts, because the speed at which incurable turned into preventable by force is staggering.
It really is.
If doctors believed they couldn't cure the current generation of patients, they decided their moral imperative was to stop the next generation from being born.
And the logic was brutal, but entirely cohesive within the scientific paradigm of the time. This wasn't a fringe movement. Eugenics was championed by the leading biologists, psychiatrists, and political progressives of the era.
They viewed it as a public health initiative.
Right. If we drain swamps to stop malaria, the thinking went, we must restrict the reproduction of the unfit to stop the spread of madness and feeble-mindedness.
And this wasn't just theoretical debate. It became hard law.
Yes, it did.
Throughout the first half of the 20th century, compulsory sterilization laws were enacted across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia. Tens of thousands of asylum inmates, predominantly the poor and marginalized, were surgically sterilized against their will by the state.
And as the historical record grimly documents, this philosophy found its ultimate horrifying realization in Nazi Germany.
Right.
The Action T4 program wasn't a military operation. It was conceived and executed as a medical program. Before the Holocaust expanded to target ethnic and religious groups, it began with the systematic murder of approximately 300,000 psychiatric patients and people with intellectual disabilities.
And the perpetrators were doctors and nurses who utilized the prevailing psychiatric consensus to justify mass murder as an act of societal hygiene.
The ultimate devastating consequence of speeding down the wrong side of the highway with absolute certainty.
It is the starkest possible reminder of why epistemic humility is a life or death requirement in medicine. Following the horrors of the eugenics movement and the stagnation of the massive state asylums, the field of psychiatry enters the 20th century desperate for rigorous empirical science.
They are looking for a way out of the darkness.
And what happens next is fascinating because the search for scientific truth splits the entire field down the middle. We get a massive fork in the road.
The mind-body split. Psychiatry fractures into two distinct, often deeply antagonistic camps. Biological psychiatry, which looked exclusively at the brain's hardware, and psychoanalysis, which looked exclusively at the mind's software.
Okay, let's follow the hardware guys first. Biological psychiatry had a spectacular early victory that basically validated their entire worldview, and it had to do with a condition called general paresis. What exactly was this?
Well, if you walked into an asylum in the late 19th century, a huge percentage of the most severely ill patients, perhaps up to 20% of the institutionalized population, were suffering from general paresis of the insane.
Wow, 20%.
It was a terrifying progressive disease. It often began with sudden, bizarre delusions of grandeur. Imagine a poor clerk suddenly believing he was an emperor with boundless wealth.
Right.
This was followed by severe cognitive decline, physical tremors, paralysis, and inevitably death.
It looked like the ultimate untreatable psychiatric madness. But the biological psychiatrists made a massive breakthrough here.
They did. They discovered that general paresis wasn't a hereditary curse. It was late-stage syphilis.
The sexually transmitted infection.
Yes. We know the mechanism now. The spearhead bacteria that causes syphilis can lay dormant in the body for years, sometimes decades, after the initial infection.
Okay.
Eventually, in some patients, the bacteria breaches the blood-brain barrier and invades the central nervous system. It literally eats away at the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain.
So the psychiatric symptoms, the megalomania, the dementia, are the direct result of this localized brain damage caused by an infectious agent.
Exactly. The impact of that discovery is just hard to overstate. They proved that a profound psychological syndrome could be definitively linked to a specific microscopic biological invader.
And once penicillin was discovered, this terrifying fatal madness could be cured with a simple antibiotic.
It was a huge triumph, and it completely electrified the field. The biological psychiatrists assumed they had found the Rosetta Stone.
The logic was, if general paresis is just syphilis, then schizophrenia must just be another undiscovered virus.
Right. Depression must be a specific neurochemical lesion. Bipolar disorder must be a simple genetic mutation. They believed they were only decades away from finding this specific biological key for every single psychiatric disorder.
But the historical record calls this a false dawn. Why?
Because the brain refused to cooperate with that level of simplicity. A century later, despite staggering advances in neuroscience, functional MRI scans, and human genome mapping, we still do not have a simple biological test like a blood draw or a brain scan that can definitively diagnose schizophrenia or major depression.
Really? Still nothing that clear-cut?
No. The biology of mental illness is infinitely more complex, highly polygenic, and deeply entangled with environmental stressors than a simple bacterial infection.
So they were looking for a broken gear in a watch, but the brain is an ecosystem.
That's a great way to put it.
Which brings us to the other fork in the road. While the biologists were looking through microscopes at brain tissue, another camp decided the physical brain was the wrong place to look entirely. Enter Sigmund Freud.
Freud and the birth of psychoanalysis. If biological psychiatry was trying to map the hardware of the brain, Freud was trying to debug the software of the mind.
I really love the hardware-software analogy. It's like the hardware guys are taking apart the motherboard, looking for a burnt-out microchip or a frayed wire to explain why the computer keeps crashing.
Right.
And Freud is looking at the exact same crashing computer and saying, the physical wiring is perfectly fine. The problem is a deeply corrupted file hidden in the operating system installed 10 years ago, and it's running a background script that is crashing the whole machine.
It's a highly effective way to conceptualize his approach. Freud argued that psychiatric symptoms, like hysteria, severe phobias, paralyzing anxiety, were not meaningless neurological static.
Okay.
They were the visible manifestations of invisible unconscious conflicts.
He theorized that human beings actively repress painful, socially unacceptable desires and traumatic childhood memories into the unconscious.
Right. But that repression requires massive psychological energy, and eventually the repressed material forces its way to the surface disguised as a psychiatric symptom.
Now, when we evaluate Freud's legacy based on the modern empirical standards in our sources, it is a profoundly mixed bag, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The specific software bugs he claimed to identify have largely failed to survive scientific scrutiny.
Like his intricate theories about infantile sexuality.
Or the Oedipus complex and the specific architecture of the id, ego, and superego. Those are mostly viewed today as historical artifacts rather than scientific realities.
He built this incredibly elaborate, rigid system that often couldn't be proven or disproven, which is a major red flag in science.
Exactly. However, we cannot discard Freud entirely because his broader conceptual insights fundamentally rewired how humanity understands itself.
He established some foundational premises that survive today.
He did. 3 main ones. First, that symptoms have profound psychological meaning. They are trying to tell us something about the patient's lived experience.
Second, that the therapeutic relationship itself, the act of speaking and being heard by an empathetic clinician, is a powerful mechanism for healing.
The talking cure.
Yes, the talking cure. And third, the realization that early childhood development and attachment profoundly, durably shape adult psychological resilience.
You can discard the specifics of Freud's theories, but those 3 pillars remain the absolute bedrock of almost all contemporary psychotherapy.
So, entering the mid-20th century, you have this massive tension. The psychoanalysts are spending years talking to patients about their childhoods, while the biological psychiatrists are giving patients electroconvulsive therapy, desperate to physically reboot the brain.
It was a real tug of war.
But in 1952, a completely accidental discovery drops a bomb on the entire debate.
The pharmaceutical revolution. The discovery of chlorpromazine.
This is one of those accidents of history that changes the world overnight. Because chlorpromazine was not developed to treat schizophrenia?
No, it wasn't. It was synthesized by a French pharmaceutical company looking to create a better surgical anesthetic and antihistamine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they wanted a drug that would calm patients down before surgery without simply knocking them unconscious. But when psychiatrists began testing it on highly agitated, psychotic patients in the asylums, the results were unlike anything they had ever seen.
It didn't just sedate them, it actually seemed to stop the hallucinations.
Because, as we later discovered, it was blocking D2 dopamine receptors in the brain. For the first time in human history, doctors had a pill that could reliably, visibly reduce the most terrifying symptoms of severe mental illness.
And within a few short years, chlorpromazine, which was marketed as Thorazine, was being prescribed to millions.
And it opened the floodgates. Soon we had early antidepressants like MAOIs and tricyclics, and mood stabilizers like lithium.
Suddenly, psychiatry isn't just theory anymore. They have a toolkit. They have tangible biological interventions that work, at least to some degree.
Yes, and this new pharmacological power collided directly with a massive social movement, deinstitutionalization.
Deinstitutionalization is arguably the most consequential social policy shift in modern psychiatric history. To understand why it happened, you have to look at the mounting ferocious critique of the asylum system that peaked in the 1960s.
Because by the 1960s, these state hospitals were bloated, crumbling, underfunded nightmares.
Precisely. In 1961, the sociologist Irving Goffman published a seminal book called Asylums. Goffman spent months doing field work inside a massive psychiatric hospital, and his conclusion was devastating.
He coined the term total institution.
Right. He argued that the regimented, deeply impersonal environment of the asylum actively stripped away a person's identity. The institution itself was inducing a unique type of pathology.
The patients weren't just suffering from schizophrenia, they were suffering from institutionalization.
You had civil rights lawyers, human rights advocates, and anti-psychiatry thinkers like Thomas Szasz, all arguing that holding people against their will in these warehouses was fundamentally oppressive. There was a massive moral push to set these people free.
But moral crusades are rarely successful unless they align with economic incentives.
Sure.
And this progressive human rights-based critique found a very powerful, very cynical ally.
State governments desperate to slash their budgets.
Exactly, because running a sprawling hospital system with thousands of patients and staff is astronomically expensive.
Right, so you have this perfect storm. Progressives want the hospitals closed for moral reasons. Fiscal conservatives want them closed for economic reasons.
And the new pharmaceutical drugs provide the perfect scientific justification to do it. The prevailing argument became, we don't need these expensive, abusive hospitals anymore. We have the pill.
We can discharge the patients, they can take their medication, and they can live freely in the community.
It sounds like a perfect solution. But what actually happened was a catastrophe.
Why?
Because they only executed half of the plan.
The plan was supposed to be close the big state hospitals, take all that money, and build a massive decentralized network of well-funded community mental health centers.
Places where discharged patients could get therapy, housing support, and regular medication management.
But that community infrastructure was never built.
The funding was constantly slashed or diverted. The political will just vanished the moment the asylums were emptied.
So you had hundreds of thousands of profoundly vulnerable people, many of whom had been institutionalized for decades and had no life skills, handed a bottle of powerful antipsychotics and simply pushed out the door.
into a society that had absolutely zero safety net to catch them.
And if you give someone a drug that blunts their hallucinations but causes severe weight gain, lethargy, and physical tremors, and you don't give them a home or a support system, they are going to stop taking the drug.
Inevitably. The outcomes of deinstitutionalization without community support were exactly as dire as you would predict. A massive surge in homelessness among the severely mentally ill.
And a phenomenon known as the revolving door.
Right, where patients cycled endlessly through acute psychiatric crises, short-term emergency room stabilization, and discharge back to the streets.
Which leads us directly to the grim reality of the present day. Because when the medical system fails to contain a crisis, the legal system takes over.
We basically traded one form of confinement for another. Today, the largest psychiatric facilities in many developed countries are not hospitals, they are massive county jails and state prisons.
We criminalize the fallout of untreated severe mental illness. The patients went from the asylum to the streets to the cell block.
All under the banner of pharmaceutical progress and liberation.
It's a staggering policy failure. But let's look at what this shift did to the medical profession itself. You now have millions of patients scattered across the community, seeing private doctors, being prescribed these powerful new drugs.
And the psychiatric establishment realized they had a massive logistical problem.
Which was?
They had no standardized way to agree on who is actually sick.
They needed a universal language. If a doctor in New York and a doctor in California are both prescribing Thorazine, they need a reliable way to ensure they are treating the exact same condition.
And prior to 1980, that reliability just did not exist.
Enter the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is the absolute rule book of modern psychiatry.
The pivotal moment was the publication of the DSM-3 in 1980. Before this, the manual was heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory. Diagnoses were often vague, narrative descriptions based on presumed unconscious conflicts.
The problem with that is, if a patient saw 3 different psychiatrists, they were highly likely to walk out with 3 entirely different diagnoses, depending on how each doctor interpreted their unconscious.
Which is a disaster if you are trying to conduct scientific research. How do you test if a new drug works for depression if doctors can't even agree on who actually has depression?
It lacked basic scientific validity and reliability. So the architects of the DSM-3 radically overhauled the entire system. They stripped away all the psychoanalytic theory and moved to a purely descriptive, symptom-based checklist model.
They didn't care why you were depressed. They only cared about what you were experiencing. To be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you had to meet a specific number of symptoms like insomnia, weight loss, and low mood.
For a specific duration of time, say 2 weeks.
Exactly. The goal was pure mechanical reliability. If the patient checks 5 of these 9 boxes, they have the disease. It doesn't matter if the doctor's in New York or London, the diagnosis is the same.
And in terms of standardizing the global language of psychiatry, it was a massive success. But that standardization opened a Pandora's box of deeply complex problems. Specifically, the problem of massive diagnostic expansion.
Right. When the very first thin little DSM was published in 1952, it listed 106 recognized diagnoses. By the time we get to the DSM-5 in 2013, it is a massive tome containing over 300 diagnoses.
We nearly tripled the number of ways a human being can be classified as mentally ill.
And this rapid expansion forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Are we actually discovering hundreds of new, discrete biological illnesses?
Or are we simply lowering the threshold for what we consider pathological?
Exactly.
This is where we have to look closely at how these boundaries are drawn. Because there is a very valid argument in the sources that we are medicalizing the human condition. We are taking perfectly normal, deeply painful, but natural human experiences and branding them as diseases.
The evolution of the bereavement exclusion is a perfect example of this. For a long time, if you exhibited all the symptoms of major depression, insomnia, crying, inability to eat, but your spouse had just died, you were not diagnosed with depression.
You were diagnosed with grief. It was recognized as a normal human response to a devastating loss.
But in recent iterations of the manual, that exclusion was heavily modified or removed, meaning that if you are deeply mourning the death of a loved one for more than a couple of weeks, you can now technically be diagnosed with major depressive disorder and prescribed medication.
So, are we treating a brain disease, or are we pathologizing grief because it is socially inconvenient and unproductive?
Are we taking a child's natural biological variance in attention span and labeling it a disorder because they struggle to sit still in a rigid, standardized classroom for 8 hours a day?
And we cannot ignore the financial mechanics driving this expansion. The pharmaceutical industry is deeply intertwined with this process.
Right. If a DSM committee decides to lower the symptom threshold for a particular disorder, making it easier to diagnose, the market for the drug that treats that disorder instantly expands by millions of potential customers.
It is a documented reality in our sources that the pharmaceutical industry funds a vast amount of psychiatric research, and that many members of the panels who write the DSM have significant financial ties to pharmaceutical companies.
This conflict of interest creates a very murky space where commercial incentives to sell pills blur the lines of genuine medical necessity.
But it's not just money that shapes the rulebook, it's culture. And there is one historical event regarding the DSM that perfectly illustrates how the definition of illness is dictated by social values, not just biological. We need to look at the 1973 removal of homosexuality from the manual.
This is a watershed moment in the history of medicine. Maintaining strict neutrality based solely on the historical text, for the first 2 editions of the DSM, homosexuality was officially codified as a sociopathic personality disturbance and later as a sexual deviation.
It was, by medical consensus, a mental illness requiring treatment.
But in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove it, and we need to be very precise about how that happened.
It was not because a researcher discovered a new gene. It wasn't because a new brain scan provided objective biological data proving it was a natural variation.
No. The historical record is entirely clear. The change was driven by sustained, intense activism from gay rights organizations following events like the Stonewall riots.
Activists relentlessly pressured the psychiatric establishment, disrupting conferences and demanding that the profession examine its own cultural biases.
The original inclusion of homosexuality was a reflection of mid-century cultural prejudice, masquerading as objective science. Its removal was the result of social and political evolution, forcing the medical establishment to course correct.
Which proves the ultimate point about the DSM. It is not an objective, immutable ledger of natural facts, like the periodic table of elements.
Right. It is a living, breathing document that reflects the values, the blind spots, and the power dynamics of the society that writes it.
And all of this history, the shifting definitions, the rise of the pharmaceutical industry, the catastrophic failure of deinstitutionalization, the expansion of the DSM, all of it lands us squarely in the present moment.
Facing a contemporary mental health crisis that is testing the limits of this entire system.
And that crisis is centered acutely on young people. Across the developed world, we are seeing a terrifying, documented deterioration in adolescent mental health. And the debate over why this is happening seems to center around a very specific inflection point, the year 2012.
The 2012 inflection point is one of the most hotly contested areas of current empirical research. Researchers like Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt look at the longitudinal data and point out that rates of adolescent depression, anxiety, and self-harm were relatively stable for decades, but then suddenly skyrocketed right around 2012.
And their argument for why 2012 is the tipping point is entirely technological. That is the exact moment when smartphone ownership crossed the 50% threshold.
And when social media platforms deeply integrated algorithmic feeds and like buttons.
So they argue there is a direct causal mechanism. The sudden immersion of the developing adolescent brain into a hyper-connected digital environment designed to hijack the dopamine system.
The constant, quantifiable social comparison, the sleep deprivation caused by late-night scrolling, the algorithmic amplification of outrage and despair.
They argue these technological shifts fundamentally rewired the architecture of childhood, resulting in a population-level psychological crisis.
It is a very compelling narrative. But presenting both sides neutrally, it is not the only way to read the data.
No, it is heavily debated. Researchers like Candace Odgers push back strongly against the smartphone as sole cause narrative.
They point out significant methodological flaws in the studies linking screen time to depression, noting that the correlations are often surprisingly weak.
Right, the classic correlation does not equal causation problem. Are kids depressed because they are on their phones 10 hours a day? Or are they on their phones 10 hours a day because they are already depressed and withdrawing from the physical world?
Furthermore, Odgers and others point out that large-scale experiments where social media is actively restricted do not always result in the massive improvements in mental health that the technological theory would predict.
They argue that blaming phones distracts us from broader, systemic drivers of distress: the lingering economic insecurity following the 2008 recession, climate anxiety, the intense pressure of modern academic competition.
And the actual physical isolation of modern suburban life. The causal mechanism is fiercely debated.
But what is completely uncontested is the empirical reality of the suffering. The rates of self-harm and clinical distress, particularly among adolescent girls, represent a genuine tragedy.
And as a culture, as we try to process and explain this crisis, we have developed a very specific way of talking about it.
We really have adopted a new vernacular. The language of clinical psychiatry has escaped the therapist's office and saturated mainstream culture.
We call it therapy speak. It is everywhere. You cannot scroll through social media or sit in the coffee shop without hearing people casually deploy highly specific clinical terms to describe everyday friction.
People don't just have a disagreement anymore. They accuse the other person of gaslighting them. Someone isn't just rude or difficult. They are a toxic narcissist.
We talk about setting boundaries, being triggered by a movie, or experiencing trauma from a bad date.
On one hand, this represents a democratization of psychological literacy. People finally have the vocabulary to identify and articulate their inner emotional lives. They are prioritizing their mental well-being.
But the history we've discussed today forces us to ask a critical question about this linguistic shift. Are we diluting the precision of these clinical terms?
Yeah, because trauma, in a psychiatric context, refers to a profound, life-altering psychological injury that fundamentally rewires the nervous system.
And gaslighting is a sustained, calculated campaign of psychological abuse designed to make a victim doubt their own sanity.
So if I have a difficult, highly annoying conversation with my boss and I come home and tell my friends I was traumatized by his gaslighting, I am using the language of severe pathology to describe normal workplace adversity.
Does doing that actually change your lived experience?
That's the real question. It might. Language creates reality. If we continually frame everyday distress, discomfort, and interpersonal conflict through the lens of severe psychiatric injury, do we inadvertently make ourselves more fragile?
Do we lose the ability to distinguish between a clinical crisis requiring medical intervention and the normal, painful friction of simply being a human being interacting with other flawed human beings?
It feels like we all have a mini DSM downloaded into our brains, and we are constantly diagnosing ourselves and everyone around us. We are constantly drawing new boundaries of illness.
And as we've seen today, the boundaries we draw around illness dictate how society functions.
Which brings us to the end of the road, at least for now. We have traced an incredible, often horrifying arc today. From exorcising demons in ancient Mesopotamia to bleeding patients to balance their humors in Greece.
From burning women at the stake for having visions to warehousing the poor in the Great Confinement.
We saw the radical hope of unchaining the asylums devolve into the horrors of forced sterilization. We watched the professions split between the hardware of syphilis and the software of Freud.
Only to be radically unified by the accidental discovery of a pill.
We emptied the hospitals, filled the prisons, wrote a massive rule book, and now find ourselves diagnosing each other on our smartphones.
If there is a single unifying thread running through this entire history, it is the vital necessity of epistemic humility.
Right.
In every era, humanity was doing its absolute best to solve a terrifying problem with the limited tools and knowledge it possessed.
But the tragedy always occurred when they forgot their tools were limited. When they conflated their current social norms, their moral judgments, or their economic convenience with objective biological truth.
We always think we are purely fixing a biological machine, when very often we are just violently enforcing a social norm.
The certainty is what makes it dangerous. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought, a question I want you, the listener, to carry with you after you finish this deep dive.
We have established that every single era of medicine, look back at the era that preceded it with absolute, unmitigated shock at their ignorance and cruelty.
The biological psychiatrists of the 20th century were horrified by the asylum doctors of the 19th. The asylum doctors were horrified by the inquisitors of the 16th.
It is an unbroken chain of historical shock and revision.
So here is the question. Given that history, what is the universally accepted, unquestioned professional consensus about mental health today? What specific pill are we prescribing by the millions? What therapeutic framework are we certain is the truth? Or what diagnostic category are we currently expanding?
Wait.
That the deep divers of the year 2126 will look back on with that exact same horror.
It is an unsettling question, but it's the only question that keeps us from speeding down the wrong side of the highway.
Because right now, the sun is shining, the engine is humming, and we feel very confident about the road ahead. But we must always, always check the signs. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the frameworks around you, stay curious, and we will see you next time.